The scent of rosewood and vanilla hung in the grand hall of the Fenwick Foundation's charity auction, held at the heart of downtown Boston's Old Marble Museum. Carla Winslow, in a navy blue velvet gown she'd stitched herself, was adjusting an art installation near the bar. Her design firm wasn't launched yet, but she volunteered for exposure. At 29, she'd spent the last decade working under famous designers, often in the shadows, her brilliance overlooked for lack of pedigree. With chestnut brown eyes full of longing, and fingers that sketched dreams into spaces, Carla was a visionary in a city that rarely gave second chances. She grew up in RUlN, Massachusetts, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs after her father disappeared. Her dream was simple: build homes that made people feel less alone. She wasn't there to flirt, she wasn't dressed to impress. But fate didn't care about plans. Across the room, Grayson Maddox was leaning against the mahogany bar, sipping a glass of Glenfiddich 18 with a jawline sculpted by quiet arrogance. At 32, he was already making headlines in the startup world as the brain behind an AI algorithm designed to detect behavioral shifts in users, part medical innovation, part commercial surveillance. A graduate of MIT with a minor in psychology and major in ambition, Grayson had climbed from nothing. His father, a mechanic, died when he was 11, and his mother cleaned university dorms just to keep him enrolled in public school. His drive to win wasn't noble, it was personal. Grayson had already burned through friendships and one engagement for his startup dreams, now chasing high-profile investors to scale. But tonight, something about the woman rearranging tulips near the silent auction table pulled his eyes. Not her body. Not her face. But the stillness, how she commanded space like she designed the world. Their first words weren't spoken but sparked through a shared laugh. A clumsy guest tripped over a lighting cable, toppling a wine stand near Carla's exhibit. As she rushed to salvage her work, Grayson helped without hesitation, kneeling beside her, murmuring, "Your layout's better than the buildings." She looked up, startled, then laughed. That was it. They spent the next hour talking about architecture, forgotten spaces, and the psychology of color. Carla, always reserved, found herself drawn to the contradiction Grayson embodied, steel ambition wrapped in a calming voice. He, in turn, was mesmerized by how someone so kind could still be so sharp. They exchanged numbers before parting, but both hesitated before texting. That night, Carla sketched a design called Clash of Elements. Grayson named a new prototype Velvet Steel. Neither admitted they'd drawn their inspiration from each other. And neither realized that a single night had just rewritten the course of both their lives. Carla's phone vibrated the next morning as sunlight filtered through her loft window. Grayson Maddox, coffee? Not to flirt. Just to steal more of your genius. She stared at it for a while before smiling. Their first coffee turned into 3 more that week, each one stretching past midnight conversations at indie cafes and cozy bookstores across Boston. Carla had always been cautious with love, often losing herself in floor plans and design mock-ups, but with Grayson, there was a thrill she hadn't expected. They discovered shared loves, late-night jazz, hiking abandoned architecture, sketching in silence. Grayson brought her homemade chai one morning when she was sick and stayed to rearrange her studio's filing cabinet alphabetically, laughing the whole time. Carla found herself opening up about her childhood, her father's disappearance, the tiny Christmas tree her mother used to decorate with dollar store lights and unmatched buttons. Slowly, her trust grew. Grayson, for all his charm, was a man of walls, built high, reinforced by betrayal, and decorated with trophies he never truly celebrated. But Carla saw through it. She saw how he twitched when people mentioned his mother, how he stared too long at old bookstores but never entered, how he would pause at photographs of people smiling as if he couldn't remember what real peace looked like. Still, Carla persisted gently, never pushing. She brought warmth in places Grayson never realized were cold. Meanwhile, Carla's younger sister, Nina Winslow, a free-spirited, tattooed graduate student in psychology, was skeptical. "He's a storm, Car. A beautiful one, but still dangerous," she warned after dinner one night. And on the other side, Ethan Maddox, Grayson's older brother, a struggling novelist with a sharp wit and melancholic eyes, quietly asked Grayson if he was using Carla to soften his public image for investors. Grayson laughed it off, but the question lingered. Things shifted the day Grayson's app, MindPath, flopped publicly. Investors pulled out, the tech community mocked him, and journalists compared him to a poor man's Zuckerberg with trust issues. He spiraled, drinking, snapping, isolating. But Carla didn't leave. She sat with him through his silence, helped draft a rebranding strategy, cooked dinner even when he didn't eat, and lent him money from her slowly growing savings. Tammy, Carla's best friend and business-savvy roommate, raised an eyebrow but didn't interfere, yet. She admired Carla's loyalty but feared Grayson's chaos would drown them both. Meanwhile, Carla's interior projects began gaining traction in the boutique world, and she secretly put her earnings aside for her dream, her own firm. Even in Grayson's darkness, she stayed a light. And though neither said it aloud, everyone watching knew, Carla loved Grayson more than he loved himself. And that would become both her strength and her undoing. It was during a snowy weekend getaway in Stowe, Vermont, that Grayson proposed. The mountains sparkled with powdered frost beneath a pale sun, and Carla was bundled in a gray wool coat and leather gloves, her cheeks red from the cold. They'd spent the day dog sledding and sketching cabin interiors on napkins over hot cocoa. As night fell, Grayson led her to a frozen lake where lanterns formed a heart on the ice. In the center, he dropped to one knee with a vintage rose gold ring he said reminded him of the first time he saw her surrounded by her floral installation. Carla gasped, tears falling before she could even say yes. He didn't speak of forever, only of the life they would build from scratch, and she clung to that promise like scripture. That night in bed, her head on his chest, she whispered her fears. He kissed her forehead and said, "I'll protect us. Always." But something in his voice felt rehearsed. Back in Boston, whispers started surfacing. Carla's best friend, Tammy Gonzalez, had been consulting for a new startup and crossed paths with a stunning venture capitalist named Celeste Harmon, tall, icy-eyed, magnetic. Celeste had funded two of the biggest female-led tech brands in the past 3 years and now had her sights on mental health AI platforms, including MindPath. Tammy noticed Grayson's name on Celeste's calendar and casually mentioned it to Carla, assuming she already knew. But Carla didn't. Just a business pitch, Grayson later claimed with a smile, brushing her hair behind her ear. Still, Carla noticed his phone began buzzing more during late hours. He stepped out more often. She once found a forgotten silk scarf in his car's glove box and assumed it was Tammy's. She was wrong. Carla's instincts sparked questions, but she silenced them beneath a blanket of trust. After all, Grayson was stressed. The tech world was brutal. What she didn't know was that Celeste wasn't just investing in startups, she was handpicking men who were hungry enough to devour anything for power. Behind the glitz of networking events and investment dinners, Celeste weaved herself into Grayson's world like poison in perfume. At first, it was lunches, then exclusive weekend retreats under the guise of tech summits. She dangled influence like diamonds, a speaking spot at Forbes Tech, a front-page feature on Fast Company, whispers of acquisition offers. Grayson was starved for redemption, and Celeste fed him illusions of empire. Her seduction wasn't physical, not at first. It was psychological. She called him underrated genius, studied his code, gave feedback that no investor ever cared to offer. And it worked. Grayson, once deeply loyal, began to view Carla as a beautiful side story in a novel he no longer had time to read. Still, he played the perfect fiancé in public, gentle, loving, affectionate. But every time Carla looked into his eyes, she felt something slipping. She didn't know it yet, but her fairy tale was becoming a transaction. And the one selling her happiness was the man she loved. The wedding of Carla Winslow and Grayson Maddox was the social event of the season, a glittering affair at the Boston Public Library, transformed by Carla's elegant design into a dreamscape of ivy-draped staircases, vintage chandeliers, and candlelit walkways. Carla, in a dress she designed and hand-stitched herself, wore minimal makeup and a radiant smile, her heart full of hope. Tammy stood by her side as maid of honor, holding back tears as Carla walked down the aisle to a string quartet version of Etta James at last. Grayson looked handsome in a custom dark navy tux, his hair slicked back, eyes trained on his bride like she was the most precious thing in the room. But behind those eyes swirled calculations. He had just finalized a secret deal with Celeste that morning. Her firm was investing 7 figures into Maddox Technologies under the condition that Grayson retained full ownership, with Carla excluded from all decisions. He said his vows convincingly. Carla believed every word. As guests cheered and clinked champagne glasses, an unexpected figure arrived at the reception. Celeste Harmon, in a blood-red gown that shimmered like fire, moved through the crowd like a ghost slipping between the living. She claimed to be there as a silent investor and handed a custom gift box to Grayson, a vintage Italian watch with a discreet engraving inside, "Time always reveals truth." Carla's stomach twisted when she saw her. The introduction was brief, and Grayson downplayed the connection with a kiss on Carla's temple and a promise to explain later. Nina, dressed in a lilac wrap dress, pulled Carla aside. "That woman gives me chills," she said. Ethan, observant and unusually quiet, handed Carla a small envelope as a wedding gift. "Open it later, alone," he whispered. Inside was a letter written in Ethan's flowing cursive. The final line read, "Never trust a man who smiles more at ambition than he does at you." Carla tucked it into her clutch and forgot about it, for now. Later that night, as the crowd faded and the stars stretched over the Charles River, Carla and Grayson slow danced beneath fairy lights on the rooftop of their suite. He held her close, whispered, "We're unstoppable now," and she melted into his chest. But beneath his lips lay buried intentions, and in the reflection of the rooftop glass, Celeste watched from a parked black sedan across the street, smirking, swirling a glass of scotch between her fingers. She hadn't come just to haunt Carla, she'd come to ensure Grayson didn't forget the terms of their partnership. In her hand was a list, every asset, password, and clause that tethered Carla's name to Grayson's growing empire. This marriage wasn't love to Celeste. It was leverage. And though Carla would spend the next few months wrapped in bliss, designing their new shared life, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted. And soon, they would bloom in venom. The turquoise waters of Santorini shimmered beneath the morning sun as Carla stepped out onto the private villa's balcony, barefoot and wrapped in a linen robe, her face glowing with post-wedding bliss. Their honeymoon villa overlooked the Caldera cliffs, whitewashed walls, blue domes, and trailing bougainvilleas set the scene for what Carla believed was the beginning of forever. Grayson had booked the most exclusive villa, an infinity pool, private chef, and even a string quartet flown in for dinner. But amidst all the luxury, there was an unsettling quiet in him. He smiled when expected, touched her shoulder softly, and even made love that first night, but something was missing, a spark that used to ignite the air between them. Carla tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion from the wedding, but when she woke up at 2 a.m. and found him whispering into his phone on the balcony in a voice too soft and familiar, doubt crawled across her chest. Grayson claimed he was talking to his developer in Singapore. Carla didn't press, not then. She wasn't the jealous type. But the calls continued. At odd hours. In different languages. One evening, while he was showering, Carla picked up his phone to check their flight details. A notification popped up from CH. Her heart skipped. Celeste Harmon. The message was cryptic, "Your silence is expensive. See you in Zurich next month." Carla's breath hitched, her skin prickling. She placed the phone back exactly where it was, her heart hammering, her instincts screaming, but her mind refusing to jump to conclusions without evidence. The next morning, she asked Grayson if Celeste had reached out. He laughed casually and said Celeste was just sending over a future investment timeline and that Zurich was a tech summit he hadn't mentioned yet because it wasn't important. He kissed her forehead and pulled her close. "This week is ours, baby. No business." And just like that, the mask slipped back on, polished, perfect, unbothered. But masks don't stay on forever. 3 nights before their return flight, Carla received an anonymous email with no subject line and only one attachment, A blurry photo of Grayson and Celeste seated close at a bar during what appeared to be a San Diego tech convention, the same weekend he claimed to be in Seattle. Her hands trembled as she read the email's signature line, "You deserve better." From someone who watched it all. She didn't confront him. Not then. She saved the image to a hidden folder and forced herself to smile over breakfast the next day. She needed time to think. To plan. To know if she was just being paranoid. Or being played. That morning, Grayson slipped a necklace around her neck, a sapphire teardrop. "For every moment I've failed you," he said, eyes gleaming. Carla nodded, whispered thank you, and returned his kiss. But in her heart, something had cracked. Her dream honeymoon had become a quiet war zone. And she didn't even know who her enemy was yet. Back in Boston, Carla poured herself into launching her dream, an intimate interior design firm named Winslow Aesthetic Spaces. With Tammy as her brand strategist and her growing portfolio of boutique cafes and brownstone lofts, things finally felt like they were taking shape. Carla believed if she could anchor herself in her career, the turbulence she felt in her marriage would calm. She buried the honeymoon doubts beneath to-do lists and textured swatches. Yet, while she created spaces of comfort for clients, her own home with Grayson became colder by the day. He stopped coming home before midnight, citing developer meetings and product testing. The man who once texted her sketches and silly riddles during lunch breaks now left her messages no longer than a sentence, often missing punctuation. On some nights, she would find the guest room door slightly ajar, sheets rumpled. When she asked about it, he said he didn't want to disturb her when he worked late. Carla nodded, but inside, something wilted. Unbeknownst to Carla, Grayson had entered into a new phase of deception. Celeste had moved beyond flirtation. She now wielded Grayson's desperation as leverage. Their affair, carefully timed and surgically managed, bloomed within her luxury penthouse under the pretense of late-night business meetings. She promised him an expanded launch, European partners, and even whispered rumors of a potential Forbes 30 under 40 profile. But her investments came with invisible shackles. She demanded full control over product design, media narrative, and how Grayson publicly carried his personal brand. "You need to appear unattached. Freedom sells better than fidelity," she'd said, sliding her fingers beneath his shirt collar as he signed another confidentiality clause. Grayson had long since surrendered his integrity to ambition. With each dinner, each drink, each night in her bed, he became less of the man Carla had married and more of a puppet she fine-tuned. And still, he smiled in every photo Carla posted of them. Still, he played the doting husband for public image. But behind his polished grin, rot was festering. One Friday evening, Nina decided to follow her instincts. Something about her brother-in-law had never sat right. She waited until dusk and tracked Grayson's Tesla after he said he was attending a Tech Awards dinner. Instead of a ballroom, she watched him park outside a high-rise condo and enter with no coat and no briefcase. After 2 hours of waiting in her car, a woman she recognized from social media exited in a crimson coat, Celeste Harmon. Her arm brushed the side of Grayson's car as she tapped on his window with a wink. Nina snapped several photos from a distance, her stomach churning. But before she could drive off, Grayson's headlights flicked on, startling her. In a flash of panic, she backed into a trash bin, drawing his attention. Grayson approached her vehicle, furious. Nina lied about car trouble, but Grayson wasn't fooled. That weekend, she found a brand new car in her driveway with a bow and a message, "Don't follow what doesn't concern you." She never showed Carla the photos. Carla stood before the crumbling Maddox ancestral estate in Newton, a massive Victorian home with peeling paint, boarded-up windows, and a ghost of history aching to be revived. It had been Grayson's childhood home before his parents' financial struggles forced them to sell. He presented it now as a gift, something they could renovate together as their first major project. Carla was thrilled, eager to blend her love for restoration with his heritage. She drew up blueprints, sourced local artisans, and even planned to document the renovation as a showcase for her budding firm. What she didn't know was that Grayson had quietly used the deed as collateral to secure private funding for a high-risk crypto algorithm investment. Celeste had brokered the deal through a shell firm, convincing Grayson it was the fastest way to make his comeback and gain autonomy from public investors. Carla walked the creaky floorboards each day with dreams in her eyes, unaware that the house had become a pawn in a game she wasn't even invited to play. Meanwhile, Ethan Maddox, always skeptical of his younger brother's choices, discovered traces of the betrayal during a visit to Carla's studio. While flipping through her renovation spreadsheets, he noticed a document titled Title Transfer Guardian Blockchain Holdings. Alarmed, he dug deeper. A few discreet calls confirmed that the company was a dummy corporation linked to Celeste Harmon's international portfolio. Confronting Grayson led nowhere. Grayson cornered Ethan the next morning in their father's old garage and, with chilling composure, threatened to expose Ethan's past struggles with substance abuse and plagiarized book proposals if he didn't back off. Worse, he presented Ethan with a legally binding NDA, already notarized and backdated. Grayson wasn't the wide-eyed genius anymore, he was cold, calculating, and methodical. Ethan, deeply conflicted and burning with guilt, signed the document to protect himself. That night, he nearly drove to Carla's apartment but turned back. He knew what was coming, but cowardice, drenched in shame, won. And Carla continued planning the estate's grand reopening with stars in her eyes. Amidst the architectural blueprints and scented candles that filled Carla's workspace, small discrepancies began to appear: invoices missing signatures, design deposits rerouted through unfamiliar merchant accounts, and email responses altered with subtle, suspicious changes. Tammy flagged it first, her gut sensing something deeper than clerical error. But every time she raised concerns, Carla brushed them aside. "Grayson's new financial advisor is just restructuring our joint assets," she said, repeating lines Grayson had given her word for word. One day, Carla opened a legal envelope containing foreclosure notices addressed to Maddox Estates, dated 6 weeks earlier. Her heart froze. Grayson claimed it was a paperwork error. He took her hands, looked her in the eyes, and said, "I'm handling it, baby. Trust me." And she did, for the last time. But far beyond their apartment walls, the foundations of her life were already splintering. Carla was designing dream spaces while the walls of her own world were silently collapsing around her. The rain had turned Boston's sidewalks into glossy rivers when Carla, juggling blueprints and a half-empty coffee cup, decided to spend the afternoon organizing her firm's digital books. Winslow Aesthetic Spaces had grown rapidly with her meticulous eye and Tammy's strategic push, but something about the revenue trail had started to feel off. That afternoon, her accountant forwarded an alert about a large, unauthorized withdrawal from her firm's operating account, a sum that matched nearly half of their reserve. Carla's first instinct was fraud, but when she opened the transaction history, her heart nearly stopped. The payment trail led directly to Maddox Technologies, labeled Consulting Acquisition Retainer. She froze. She had never approved any transaction to Grayson's company. Her login credentials had been used from an IP address registered at their apartment. Panic flared through her veins. She called Tammy, who immediately demanded a system audit. "Someone's laundering money through your firm, Carr," she said. "And it's someone with access to your life." Determined to confront Grayson, Carla waited until he returned from a supposed pitch meeting and laid the printed statements before him. He didn't flinch, not even a blink. Instead, he furrowed his brow, feigned confusion, then went into a half-hearted explanation about how one of his financial team members probably linked their accounts by mistake while prepping for a joint venture. Carla, emotionally exhausted and clinging to the thread of the man she married, asked if he could just fix it. Grayson kissed her forehead and said he'd speak to the auditors in the morning. That night, she watched him sleep, wondering how many other times she had dismissed her instincts in favor of trust. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Celeste sat across from a man in a pinstripe suit, a cyber forensics expert, reviewing a folder labeled Winslow Fabrication, Embezzlement Prep. She smirked at the fabricated screenshots of emails, bank transfers, and falsified invoices with Carla's forged signature. "Let the queen burn," Celeste whispered as she signed off on the next phase of the setup. The following week, Carla's world grew quieter. Clients paused contracts. Vendors stopped answering. Her firm's emails were flagged for potential fraud. Her brand's name appeared in small font headlines on legal blogs discussing creative laundering schemes in boutique firms. Tammy worked around the clock to contain the rumors, but it was as if invisible strings were pulling their reputation apart. At home, Grayson pretended to be her ally, feeding her phrases like "it's just media fluff" and "they'll clear it all up." But every time she turned away, he was texting. And late one night, Carla heard his voice through the bathroom door. No, she doesn't suspect a thing. The next morning, her laptop was locked out, her banking passwords reset. It was no longer a question of suspicion, it was war. But Carla didn't yet know that she was not only being framed. She was being hunted. And the walls she once designed to bring peace now echoed with betrayal. The restaurant was draped in soft amber lights and velvet curtains that seemed to muffle the truth. Grayson had insisted on a romantic dinner at RUlN, Boston's most exclusive rooftop bistro, claiming they needed to reconnect and breathe. Carla arrived wearing a midnight blue satin dress, her nerves smoothed only by Tammy's pep talk an hour earlier: "Play dumb, but watch everything." Grayson welcomed her with a kiss and her favorite wine already decanted, a calculated sweetness she hadn't tasted in weeks. Over roasted duck and mushroom risotto, he spoke gently about rebuilding trust, telling her he'd arranged for a legal compliance package to protect both their assets during the investigation. Carla, too disoriented from the chaos unraveling around her business, clung to his reassurances. He presented her with a leather-bound folder of documents, each tabbed and pre-initialed with sticky notes. "Just formalities," he said. "It'll show the banks you're not hiding anything." And despite the alarm pounding in her chest, she signed. Back at home, Carla placed the folder on the marble counter, not knowing she had just transferred ownership of her company, liquidated half her firm's residual accounts into a holding fund Grayson controlled, and assumed personal liability for Maddox Technologies' misallocated assets. The documents had been engineered by Celeste's legal team, perfected down to signature duplication timestamps to ensure authenticity. That night, Grayson held her while they watched an old film, Roman Holiday, his fingers tracing her collarbone while she quietly wept, unsure whether it was from relief or something more sinister. Meanwhile, Celeste watched the digital notifications roll in from her laptop across town: account transfers successful, password resets approved. Carla's digital trail now merged with Maddox Tech's financial core. She poured herself a glass of scotch and stood barefoot by her terrace, city lights reflecting off her glass like fireflies. "She just burned herself," she said, smiling as she clicked send on an anonymous tip to the Federal Fraud Division. A new hunt had begun. And Carla was the target. The next morning came like a thunderclap. Carla arrived at her office to find the doors padlocked, her company email deactivated, and her design firm's website suspended for legal violation notices. Calls to her vendors bounced. Employees gathered outside, confused and murmuring, as federal agents swarmed in black suits and flashed warrants. Carla's knees buckled as she was handed a subpoena. "Carla Winslow, you are under investigation for financial fraud, wire transfers linked to corporate laundering, and falsified filings." Her breath vanished. Tammy screamed at the agents, demanding explanations, but it was clear this had been building for months. In one cold, calculated move, Grayson and Celeste had pulled the floor from beneath Carla's life. And as Carla stood on the steps of her own company in trembling silence, she realized the documents she'd signed over candlelight had not been a gesture of love, they had been shackles and silk. And she had locked herself in them. The sun hadn't fully risen when Carla arrived at her design firm the next morning, unaware it would be her last day stepping through its doors as a free woman. The street was unusually crowded, not with clients or delivery vans, but with reporters, cameras, and federal vehicles parked at aggressive angles across the curb. Confusion gripped her chest as she pushed through the crowd, only for her arm to be seized mid-step by a stern-faced agent reading her Miranda rights. Gasps erupted. Microphones surged toward her. Flashbulbs exploded like gunshots. "Carla Winslow, you are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to falsify financial records linked to Maddox Technologies." Her vision blurred. Employees she once mentored watched from the glass windows in stunned silence as Carla, elegant in a beige trench coat and heels, was handcuffed like a criminal. Her reputation, her dreams, and her name unraveled in real time, and somewhere out there, Grayson was watching. Back in his penthouse suite, Grayson leaned against the counter in silk pajamas, sipping freshly brewed espresso while scrolling through the live feed of Carla's arrest on his tablet. Beside him, Celeste sat cross-legged in one of his shirts, champagne flute in hand, laughing softly. "To new beginnings," she said, clinking glasses with him. Their celebration was not wild or loud, it was chilling in its elegance, a quiet symphony of success played at the price of betrayal. Carla's firm was no longer hers. Her accounts were frozen. The building would soon be seized by creditors. "You played your part perfectly," Celeste purred, tossing Carla's old business card into the fireplace. Grayson offered no reaction, only a smile that hinted at long-planned satisfaction. To the world, he remained clean, a grieving husband shocked by the allegations. But in private, he reveled in his victory, unaware that karma, unlike revenge, needed no spotlight. It simply waited. And it had just begun watching. Across town, chaos bled into every corner of Carla's life. Her mother collapsed upon seeing the televised footage and was rushed to the hospital with a minor stroke. Tammy was denied access to the firm's premises and was issued a gag order pending investigation. Ethan, disgusted by his brother's actions and crippled by guilt for his silence, drove to the federal building only to find himself stopped at the door. Inside a cold interrogation room, Carla sat shivering in disbelief. "I never touched that money," she whispered again and again, as if repetition could summon truth from stone. But the world wasn't interested in truth, it wanted spectacle. She'd been framed, cornered, and publicly destroyed. And as she was moved to a holding cell, passing a reflective window that showed her tear-streaked face, a single question pounded inside her: how could the man she loved script her downfall so precisely? And what kind of monster celebrates when the woman he vowed to protect is in chains? The metallic clang of the cell door echoed like a cruel finale as Carla sat on the cold bench, her fingers trembling against her knees. Jail wasn't just confinement, it was a dismantling of dignity. The cream blouse she had worn during her arrest was now wrinkled and stained, her once composed posture reduced to tight, rigid silence. No lawyer had arrived yet. Her requests were met with sighs and delayed paperwork. Her phone call had been limited to a brief, tearful message to Nina's voicemail: "Tell Mom I'm okay. Please don't let her worry." Inside the block, the women watched her, some with pity, others with amusement. She was the designer queen from the news, now stripped of makeup, jewelry, and voice. That first night, Carla didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, replaying every touch, every promise, every kiss Grayson had given her, only to realize each one had been another thread in the rope he used to hang her future. The next day, she met Doreen Whitaker, a tall, quietly strong nurse in her 40s with silver-streaked braids and eyes that had seen more pain than most courts had tried. Doreen had been wrongfully convicted of medical negligence and a patient death, her appeal lost in legal bureaucracy, forgotten by the very hospital she once called home. Yet she held herself with grace. When Carla collapsed during lunch from emotional exhaustion, it was Doreen who lifted her, wiped her tears, and whispered, "And here, you have to choose what they won't steal from you. Choose your mind." Over the next few weeks, Doreen became Carla's lighthouse. She taught her how to fold clothes with precision, how to read the guards' moods, and how to meditate in chaos. She also showed her how to read people. The ones who smile too easily? Those are the ones that will sell you twice. Carla absorbed every word, her voice still quiet, but her mind now sharpening like glass and fire. She would survive. She had to. Outside the prison walls, Tammy was risking everything. She'd hired Jonah Patel, a former tech security consultant turned private investigator known for exposing corporate corruption. He began quietly digging through digital trails, passwords, and metadata tied to Maddox Technologies. Meanwhile, Nina had gone dark. After receiving Carla's voicemail, she packed a bag and disappeared without telling anyone, not even Tammy. Ethan, racked with guilt and fear for his brother's growing depravity, tried to contact Carla but was blocked from visiting. Even from inside, Carla felt the tremors of movement. Doreen gave her a notebook, and Carla began documenting everything she remembered, every signature, every date, every strange look, and every phrase Grayson used. In her darkest hour, stripped of her freedom and dignity, she found an unlikely gift, clarity. Carla had entered jail believing her life was over. But as she scribbled in the notebook beneath the dim cell light, she realized something different. The woman Grayson buried was already learning how to dig herself out. Weeks after Carla's arrest, Grayson sat in the executive boardroom of Maddox Technologies, the glass walls gleaming with success, the silence thick with control. But even in his polished custom suit and calm demeanor, he felt it, an itch beneath the surface, a tremor in his curated world. Celeste had become increasingly possessive since Carla's arrest, no longer the poised partner who whispered strategies over wine. Now she monitored his calls, demanded visibility into every transaction, and insisted on final approval for all public statements. "We didn't come this far to let your guilt ruin it," she snapped one morning, slamming down a list of talking points for a CNBC interview. Grayson nodded but inwardly winced. Her touch had grown colder. Her eyes, once magnetic, now glinted with threat. He received an anonymous email later that night. No subject. No sender. Just a short line and an attachment. "You can't erase the past, it records itself." Attached was a photo of him and Celeste clinking champagne over Carla's arrest on the TV. Across town, Tammy and Jonah had begun assembling the pieces. Jonah, a former NSA codebreaker before his private sector work, had unearthed damning data, timestamps of file manipulation, ghost logins accessing Carla's firm network from Grayson's penthouse, and security footage from La Lumiere the night of the document signing. It wasn't just digital. It was human. Jonah tracked down Brandon Doyle, a low-level IT associate at Maddox Technologies, recently fired after expressing ethical concerns to HR. Brandon, jittery and paranoid, initially refused to talk. But when Tammy showed him an old photo of Carla teaching a free design class to foster children, an image once used in the firm's community grant pitch, his resolve cracked. "She didn't deserve this," he whispered. "They used me." He confessed to planting false emails, rerouting Carla's passwords, and falsifying vendor invoices under Celeste's orders. When asked why, he simply said, "Because I was told she was stealing from Grayson, and she'd already done worse." The room fell silent. Tammy's hand tightened into a fist. They had him, and now they needed proof admissible in court. In the gray morning light that filtered into her prison cell, Carla reread Ethan's old wedding day letter for the 10th time. It had once seemed like poetry, now it read like a code. The sentence, "When silence screams loudest, listen for the echo that never lies," suddenly struck differently. She remembered the estate's renovation blueprints, how Ethan had asked odd questions about the property titles weeks before their wedding. Had he suspected something all along? Meanwhile, Doreen watched her from across the cell. "Your eyes have changed," she said. "They don't search anymore. They calculate." Carla gave a half-smile. She had begun writing letters, to herself, to her mother, to Nina, but she never sent them. They were pages of confession, but also of resolve. In her mind, she wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was a witness waiting for her trial. And outside, the cracks had begun to form in Grayson's empire of ice, the kind that doesn't warn before it shatters. Jonah Patel stared at the evidence wall in his apartment, lines of red string connecting documents, emails, video stills, and corporate memos. At the center, Carla's mugshot beside Grayson and Celeste's champagne celebration photo. Brandon Doyle, once trembling and hesitant, now sat across from him, recounting every step of the setup. "They told me Carla was laundering money to fund a competitor. Said she was stealing Grayson's code and using her firm as a smokescreen," Brandon said, guilt heavy in his voice. Jonah had already backed up the forensic trail, forged metadata, digital signatures lifted from Carla's devices, and a planted security breach report signed by a now-retired compliance officer who hadn't even been in the country during the alleged violation. With all this in hand, Jonah reached out to a federal prosecutor named Elena Morano, known for dismantling corporate fraud networks. Elena didn't hesitate. She issued a sealed motion to unseal Carla's case, warning, "If this is what you say it is, someone's going to prison." Carla was released under strict surveillance and a media gag order while the case was reopened. She exited through a side gate, dressed in an oversized hoodie and sweatpants provided by Tammy, her hair tied back, her eyes sunken but defiant. She didn't cry as the cool breeze touched her skin for the first time in months. She didn't speak either. Not until she was inside Tammy's car, gripping a folded piece of paper, her old business license, restored and re-registered that very morning under the name C. Winslow Interiors, LLC. "They didn't break you," Tammy whispered, her voice shaking. Carla finally replied, "No. They built something else." At a safe house Jonah arranged outside Cambridge, Carla met with Elena. As evidence was laid out before her, Carla stayed composed, taking notes, recalling every overlooked detail. "I didn't just survive," she told them. "I remember everything." Elena nodded. "Good. Because once this hits court, they're going to come after you harder than before. But this time, we're ready." Meanwhile, Grayson was in the middle of an investor demo when Celeste barged into the boardroom, her face pale, her phone shaking in her grip. "We have a problem," she hissed, dragging him into a corridor. She showed him a leaked email, the same anonymous photo of their celebratory toast, now attached to an internal ethics complaint submitted by one of Maddox Tech's junior analysts. "They're watching us," she said. "I told you not to get sloppy." Grayson, for the first time in weeks, felt his throat dry. He rushed to his office, deleted email threads, disconnected backup servers, and called his legal advisor, but the tremors had already begun. A formal subpoena arrived later that day, and the mood inside the company shifted: whispers, stares, distance. Investors pulled out silently. The stock dipped overnight. And Grayson, once the charismatic visionary, now found his empire webbed in silence and suspicion. The same silence that once protected him was now peeling back his lies, strand by strand. The attic of Ethan Maddox's brownstone was a dusty graveyard of forgotten pages, books with broken spines, and notebooks filled with rejected manuscript drafts. Carla stood quietly under the wooden beams, Jonah and Tammy beside her. After her release, Ethan's old friend and landlord, Mr. Reeves, had contacted her, saying Ethan had left behind boxes labeled "For Carla," in case Grayson falls. Her hands trembled as she opened the first one. Inside were journals filled with Ethan's neat handwriting, dated, indexed, and coded. One entry read, "Celeste is more than an investor. She's a strategist." Grayson slipping. "If I disappear, follow the Zurich accounts." Carla covered her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Ethan had known. Months before his mysterious car crash, he had compiled a dossier, screenshots, call logs, and even transcripts from phone recordings he'd taken without Grayson's knowledge. This wasn't just documentation. This was Ethan's lifeline to justice. And now, it was Carla's final weapon. Jonah worked quickly, scanning and encrypting the evidence while Tammy coordinated with Elena to submit the most damning pieces under federal seal. Ethan had even written a full timeline mapping Grayson's descent, from the moment Celeste entered his life to the laundering of funds through shell firms in Zurich, Belize, and an estate in Austria. It included a recording dated 1 week before Ethan's accident, Grayson's voice yelling, "If you ever say a word about Zurich, I swear to God, I'll ruin you." Just like I'm doing to her. Carla's heart cracked open as the truth became undeniable. Ethan's death wasn't a tragic coincidence, it was a silencing. Elena reviewed the files with growing tension. "This flips the case entirely. If we can link Ethan's death to intentional interference or threats, that's grounds for second-degree charges. Possibly even murder conspiracy." Carla remained silent, clutching Ethan's final letter. Inside was a single line, "You were always light, even when we were surrounded by shadows." That night, Carla slept for the first time in months, not in fear, but with purpose. Grayson, meanwhile, was spiraling. A routine systems audit triggered by a whistleblower exposed that someone had accessed offshore accounts linked to his name and falsified company filings. When the SEC arrived at his office unannounced, Celeste lost her composure for the first time, lashing out in front of staff. "You were supposed to cover your trail," she shouted as she stormed into his office, slamming the door behind her. "I gave you everything, power, protection, a damn empire, and you botched it for some woman you should have left buried." Grayson snapped back, "You're the one who pushed me into this mess. You said she'd break, but she's rising." In the hallway, employees heard the muffled shouting, and for the first time, no one looked away. The illusion had cracked. The empire they built on betrayal was shaking. And karma, patient, silent, and deliberate, had begun to balance the scales. The federal courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, journalists scribbling in notepads and cameras flashing just beyond the lobby doors. Carla entered flanked by Elena Morano and Jonah Patel, her face stoic, wrapped in dignity rather than revenge. It had been months since her arrest, and the public tide was beginning to shift. Supporters now lined the sidewalk outside, holding signs that read "Justice for Carla" and "Truth always surfaces." On the opposite bench, Grayson sat in a navy suit too crisp for a man unraveling, his jaw clenched, eyes flicking between Carla and the jury like a trapped animal seeking exits. Celeste arrived 30 minutes late, refusing eye contact with everyone. As the opening statements began, Elena laid out the evidence: forensic reports, offshore accounts, Brandon Doyle's testimony, Ethan's documentation, and Celeste's involvement. But it wasn't just facts that turned heads, it was Carla's quiet presence. Her calm under pressure. Her refusal to let bitterness spill into anger. She wasn't there for vengeance. She was there for truth. Grayson's defense unraveled swiftly. Under oath, Brandon testified that Celeste orchestrated the framing using Grayson as the front. When confronted with emails showing his knowledge of the plot, Grayson stammered, claiming he'd been manipulated, that Celeste blackmailed him. But the jury saw through it, especially when Elena played the damning audio recording of him threatening Ethan. The courtroom gasped. Carla, hands folded tightly in her lap, stared ahead, refusing to let the pain show. Then came the turning point. Celeste, unexpectedly called to the stand by Elena under subpoena, cracked under pressure. As Elena walked her through forged contracts and Zurich accounts, Celeste's icy facade fractured. She fumbled, contradicted herself, and when asked directly, "Did you manipulate Mr. Maddox into framing his wife for crimes she didn't commit?" she exhaled, looked at Grayson, and whispered, "Yes. But he let me." That moment shattered Grayson's final defense. The courtroom was silent. Grayson looked at Carla for the first time in weeks, not with arrogance, but with something far colder, dread. By the end of the fifth day, the verdict was unanimous. Grayson Maddox was found guilty on multiple federal charges, including fraud, perjury, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy. His sentence, 15 years in federal prison without parole. Celeste, facing her own slate of charges, was remanded into custody pending separate trial. Carla remained seated as the court clerk read the verdicts aloud, her chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. She did not cry. She did not speak. Only when it was all over, when the crowd had dispersed and the cameras turned off, did she whisper, "You buried me to build your name." And still I rose. Outside, the sky was overcast, but to Carla, it felt like sunrise. Reporters chased her for interviews. She declined every one. Justice had been served not with noise, but with quiet proof, steady resilience, and the voice of a man who had died to protect her. Ethan's gift had spoken. The court had listened. 2 weeks after the trial, Carla stood before a modest grave in Oak Hill Cemetery, the winter wind brushing against her coat as she placed a single white tulip beside the headstone that read, "Ethan Maddox, brother. Writer. Truth teller." She didn't speak, she let the silence offer what words could not. The echoes of his sacrifice still pulsed in her chest. With the help of Jonah and Elena, she had already petitioned to reopen the investigation into Ethan's accidental car crash. New evidence, including GPS tracking data showing Grayson's vehicle in the same vicinity the night of Ethan's death, had reopened the case as a criminal inquiry. Carla knew the justice system moved slowly, but she also knew the truth had claws. Before leaving, she placed Ethan's old fountain pen, the one he used to write his last letter to her, at the base of the stone. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't forget. And now, neither will they." Across the Atlantic, Celeste Harmon's luck ran dry. She had fled the U.S. on a forged diplomatic clearance through one of her European contacts and was hiding in a luxury villa in Morocco. But karma didn't negotiate with cowards. An Interpol tip, triggered by one of Elena's international appeals, led Moroccan authorities straight to her compound. Celeste was arrested while on a private yacht off the coast of Tangier, her hair blowing wildly as she screamed that it was all Grayson's fault. Her extradition process moved quickly. The moment she landed back on American soil, she was indicted on 17 federal counts, including obstruction of justice, international fraud, and conspiracy. Her bail was denied. She sat in the same detention center where Carla had once wept, now stripped of designer dresses and influence, her name splashed across tabloids not as a visionary but as a fraud queen. Carla didn't celebrate, she observed. Karma wasn't loud. It was poetic. And Celeste had finally heard its rhyme. Meanwhile, Nina returned to Boston, unannounced, exhausted, and thinner than Carla remembered. She had gone into hiding after discovering damning documents in Celeste's apartment the night she followed Grayson. Threatened by a mysterious man who claimed to be Celeste's handler, Nina disappeared, using underground networks to survive. But now that Carla was free and Grayson imprisoned, she resurfaced. The reunion between the sisters was raw and tearful. "I was scared I'd never see you again," Carla choked, hugging her tightly. Nina handed her a flash drive, encrypted, untraceable, containing the final financial ledgers that proved Grayson had been laundering money long before Carla ever suspected. "I held it in case you needed one last stone to throw," Nina said. Carla gripped it like a sword. But instead of throwing it, she filed it. She didn't need more vengeance. Her story was already echoing through the very walls they once tried to silence her with. And now, it would be her turn to build again. The Maddox ancestral estate stood like a weathered monument to a history Carla no longer feared. Once a symbol of betrayal, it now represented opportunity, a place where she would reconstruct not only walls and beams, but also the lives of women who, like her, had been broken by lies and power. Carla purchased the estate at a foreclosure auction under her new firm, Winslow and Whitaker Foundations, naming it after herself and Doreen, the woman who had become her silent warrior in the darkness of prison. With help from Tammy, Jonah, and Nina, Carla converted the vast space into a transitional shelter for women wrongfully imprisoned, emotionally abused, or manipulated into silence. No press release. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. Only intentional design, soft lighting, calming colors, private rooms, an art therapy wing, and a legal resource library. It wasn't about grandeur. It was about healing. And the irony wasn't lost on Carla. The house built by Maddox wealth was now reborn by Maddox ruin. Doreen walked the renovated halls like a matron of grace, now serving as the center's wellness coordinator and emotional counselor. She led morning meditation, taught journaling, and held restorative circle talks in the sunroom, where survivors shared stories without judgment or shame. Carla often joined silently, listening more than speaking, learning that resilience didn't always wear armor, sometimes it wore pajamas and spoke softly. Each woman carried a different scar, a mother wrongly accused of arson, a college student framed by a jealous ex, an immigrant nurse scapegoated for a medication error. Carla offered them what no court had: safety, community, and tools to begin again. Tammy organized monthly fundraising exhibits featuring artworks created by residents, while Nina led workshops on digital protection and self-worth. And as Carla watched the once-abandoned home bloom with light and laughter, she realized her revenge had never been Grayson's prison sentence, it was this legacy. A place where silence was no longer feared, and truth lived in the architecture. Carla spent her evenings on the rooftop garden, where herbs and wildflowers now grew in neat rows. It had become her place of solitude, the opposite of the courtrooms, the interviews, and the noise. One evening, as golden dust draped the skyline, she opened her journal and scribbled 3 words: "I forgive you." Not for Grayson. Not for Celeste. but for herself, for the version of Carla who once ignored her instincts, who loved too blindly, who broke in silence. That Carla had died in a courtroom. This one had risen from a blueprint of pain and rebuilt herself with grace. Her book, Framed in Love, Freed by Truth, was now in final edits, set for quiet release. No tour. No spotlights. Just her truth in bound pages. She looked down at her hands, once trembling behind bars, now building futures. And for the first time in years, she felt peace not as a destination, but as a dwelling she had designed from within. The prison library at FCI Loretto was quiet that morning, the scent of worn pages and cheap coffee clinging to the walls. Grayson Maddox, now inmate #117392J, sat hunched over a cracked plastic table, flipping aimlessly through the periodicals until something caught his eye. A soft blue paperback with a minimalist cover, Framed in Love, Freed by Truth by Carla Winslow. He froze. For a moment, the fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder. The other inmates kept to themselves, oblivious to the ghost unraveling inside him. He opened the book and read the dedication, for those who were silenced, and for the one who kept writing, even when no one listened. His throat tightened. With shaking hands, he turned to the last chapter, and there, handwritten in black ink on the final page, was a personal note from Carla herself: "You had everything, and threw it at the feet of the wrong queen. May you live long enough to see what I built from the ashes." The words burned into his mind like acid. Grayson slammed the book shut and looked around, his pulse thundering. The once proud man who orchestrated destruction from penthouses now sat in a faded jumpsuit, haunted by the permanence of what he'd lost. He thought of the nights in Celeste's arms, the wealth he chased, the reputation he tried to manufacture, and how none of it could fill the cavernous silence that now lived inside him. Letters he'd written to Carla from prison had been returned unopened. Her name, once the center of his manipulation, had now become the echo of his punishment. In his mind, he had tried to justify everything: the setup, the betrayal, the lies. But no amount of ego could dull the reality that the woman he buried had not only risen, she had soared. Her name was now on bestseller lists. Her story had become a beacon. And he was just a footnote in the book of her triumph. One he would reread, alone, in shame. Back in Boston, Carla sat beside Doreen in the shelter's art wing, sorting through sketches submitted for the annual fundraising calendar. A quiet notification pinged on her tablet. Her publisher had just confirmed Framed in Love, Freed by Truth had reached international distribution. Carla didn't smile. She didn't post. She simply closed her screen and returned to the sketches, a watercolor of a woman holding a lantern in the dark. "This one," she said, handing it to Doreen. "It says everything without a single word." Elsewhere, a prison librarian quietly placed Carla's book back on the shelf, unaware that it had reduced a man to ruins. Grayson would read it again that night, again the next, hoping to understand the woman he once loved and destroyed. But the truth was this: he never really knew her. He only saw her as an accessory. And now, she was a legacy, written in ink, sealed in silence, and built without his name. In the months that followed the book's release, Carla became a quiet icon, not a celebrity, not a social media sensation, but a symbol. Readers from around the world sent letters to the Winslow and Whitaker Foundation. Survivors mailed sketches, poems, confessions. Schools requested to add her book to their curriculum. Still, Carla refused all speaking engagements, turning down high-paying interviews, television specials, even a documentary deal. "I've said everything I needed to say," she told Tammy one evening as they sat on the porch watching residents plant winter herbs in the community garden. Her healing had not come from microphones, it had come from soil, silence, and solidarity. Carla now spent her days mentoring, helping others rebuild the stories that were stolen from them. She found joy in the laughter of the women at the center, the hum of Nina's voice teaching classes, and the smell of paint and rosemary on her hands. For her, peace wasn't an event, it was a decision. Despite her growing influence, Carla never opened her heart to romance again. Men came, philanthropists, authors, activists, all intrigued by the woman who had risen from scandal with grace. One man, Dr. Julian Mercer, a gentle-minded philanthropist with a past scarred by corporate betrayal, spent a year volunteering at the shelter and growing close to Carla. He shared her values, respected her silence, and never pushed. But when he finally confessed his feelings, Carla simply placed a hand on his and said, "I don't live in pain anymore. But I also don't live in waiting." Julian understood. He stayed on as a friend and ally. Carla's choice wasn't from bitterness, it was sovereignty. She had once been chosen for how she could serve someone else's image. Now, she chose herself every morning, to heal, to teach, to build. And that was more than enough. Love had not died in her, it had simply evolved into something broader, a love that restored others, without demanding anything in return. Tammy's wedding came in late spring, a modest celebration in a glass conservatory, filled with lilacs and jazz. Carla was the maid of honor, Nina designed the floral arrangements, and Doreen officiated the ceremony, reading from one of Ethan's unpublished poems as part of the vows. It was a day filled with joy, tears, and rebirth. Later that night, during the dance, Tammy pulled Carla aside, holding her newborn daughter. "Her name is Alicia Carla," she whispered. Carla froze, the emotion hitting her like a wave she never saw coming. "It means blessed freedom," Tammy added. For the first time in years, Carla cried without pain, just gratitude. She held the baby against her chest and smiled at the sky beyond the conservatory glass. She had not rebuilt her life to be seen. She rebuilt it so others could find their footing. Her silence had not been a void. It had been her rebellion. And her peace? It was finally permanent. The grand opening of the second branch of Winslow and Whitaker Foundation was a quiet revolution. Nestled in the heart of Brattleboro, just 40 minutes from the original shelter, it carried the same soul but with Carla's fingerprints embedded in every corner, from the hand-sewn cushions to the chalkboard menus that featured daily affirmations and community quotes. Locals filled the booths before sunrise, eager to taste not just food, but the warmth of a story that had bloomed from brokenness. Carla stood at the back entrance that morning, watching through the glass as Mira helped her father serve pastries and Emery rearranged floral vases on every table. The women here weren't victims. They were victors. The foundation wasn't just a sanctuary, it had become a launch pad for dreams once buried. Carla held the ceremonial ribbon but didn't cut it. Instead, she passed the scissors to Doreen, who turned toward the crowd and smiled. "We're not opening a building," she said. "We're opening futures." Later that afternoon, Carla returned to the rooftop garden of the original estate, where tulips swayed in the wind like silent applause. A worn copy of her book sat open beside a mug of mint tea, pages dog-eared and smudged by fingerprints from women who now walked taller. She didn't need book tours or a stage, this was her platform. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Nina joined her with a small frame in her hands. Inside it was Ethan's original wedding day letter, preserved behind glass, with Carla's scribbled notes along the margins. "You gave him justice," Nina whispered. Carla nodded, her voice barely audible. "He gave us courage." For a while, they just sat there, side by side, not speaking. The garden buzzed softly with bees, life, and legacy. There was no grief left to dig through. No past left to explain. Only peace, the kind that grows in places once abandoned. The kind that flourishes when you choose to live forward instead of looking back. That evening, as the center's windows lit up from within, Carla penned one final journal entry: "I was buried, but I grew roots. I was silenced, but I became a song. I was betrayed, but I built a home from the rubble they left behind." This is not a comeback. This is a beginning. She closed the journal and tucked it beside a folder labeled Alicia's Trust Fund, already endowed with contributions from her royalties. Across town, Grayson read those very lines printed in the final edition of Framed in Love, tucked between new chapters and updated letters. From his cell, he stared through the barred window, no longer angry, just hollow. Carla never remarried. She didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't sealed in romance, but in reinvention. She had been framed. She had been humiliated, but she had also overcome. And in the end, as karma completed its circle, Carla Winslow didn't just survive the storm, she became the architect of every sunrise that followed. The end.